Bronze Age, a time when empires thrived, trade routes stretched across seas, and mighty kings carved their names into stone. The Hittites ruled from Anatolia, the Mycenaeans flourished in Greece, and Egypt, eternal Egypt, stood as the jewel of the Nile. Great cities like Ugarit and Troy blazed with wealth and culture. For centuries, the Mediterranean world pulsed with prosperity, and then suddenly it all collapsed. Within just a few decades, entire civilizations that had stood for centuries vanished. Cities burned, palaces crumbled, and kingdoms that once seemed eternal fell into silence. What force could have brought down such powerful empires almost all at once? The ancient Egyptians left us a name, carved in stone and sung in battle hymns. The Sea Peoples. They came from beyond the horizon, with ships that cut across the Mediterranean like blades through water. They brought fire, famine, and chaos, leaving smoldering ruins in their wake. Pharaohs fought desperately to repel them. Hittite kings begged allies for aid, but none came. And as these shadowy invaders struck again and again, the very world of the Bronze Age disintegrated. Who were they? Ruthless raiders? Desperate migrants? Or an entire people seeking a new home in a crumbling world? 3,000 years later, their identity remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Tonight, we sail into the storm, into the age of fire and ruin, into the story of the Sea Peoples, the mysterious invaders who destroyed civilizations. The story of the Sea Peoples begins not with their arrival, but with the desperate cries of those who faced them. For centuries, the Bronze Age world had been held together by fragile threads, trade, alliances, and the mastery of bronze itself. Empires depended on tin and copper shipped across oceans, on grain harvests that fed cities, on treaties sealed by royal marriages. To the rulers of this age, the seas were lifelines. But one day, those lifelines carried death. The first warnings appear in letters baked into clay tablets, unearthed thousands of years later. In the archives of Ugarit, a thriving port city in modern Syria, archaeologists found a desperate plea from its king to the ruler of Cyprus. "The enemy ships are already here. My cities are burning. I need reinforcements at once." That letter was never sent. When archaeologists discovered it centuries later, the city around it had already been reduced to ash. Further south, in Egypt, Pharaoh Ramses carved his victory over strange invaders onto stone. He described them as coming from the midst of the sea, carrying entire families, men, women, and children in wagons and ships. They were not just raiders. They were migrants, conquerors, whole nations on the move. A generation later, Pharaoh Ramses III would face them again in one of the most desperate battles of Egypt's history. His inscriptions at Medinet Habu describe a storm that swept down upon the Nile Delta ships filled with warriors, their bows ready, their swords raised. Ramses claimed victory, but the very fact that he had to fight them at the gates of Egypt shows how far these mysterious peoples had already come. What makes the Sea Peoples so haunting is not just their violence, but their silence. They left behind no chronicles, no monuments, no cities we can name as theirs. Everything we know comes from their enemies, from kings who feared them, from cities that fell to them, from empires that vanished in their shadow. And so the question remains, who were they? Where did they come from? And how could a people with no written history of their own bring an entire age to its knees? The trail of evidence is scattered, fragile, and often contradictory. But by piecing together the ruins of cities, the inscriptions of pharaohs, and the myths of survivors, historians have tried to trace the outline of these elusive invaders. What emerges is a story not of a single tribe, but of a storm of peoples, displaced, desperate, and dangerous, sweeping across the Mediterranean and leaving a shattered world in their wake. And this is where our journey truly begins. The collapse did not come all at once. It came like thunder, rolling across the horizon, first distant, then deafening. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire, once a rival equal to Egypt itself, began to falter. Their great capital, Hattusa, had stood for centuries behind walls of stone, its kings commanding armies of chariots that once terrified their enemies. But the records grow silent. Archaeologists found the city abandoned, its palaces toppled, its archives unfinished. The empire of the Hittites, once invincible, had simply vanished. To the west, the Mycenaean palaces of Greece, those mighty fortresses remembered in Homer's tales, fell one by one. Pylos, Mycenae, Tyrans, all reduced to smoking ruins. The very culture that would give rise to the legends of Achilles and Agamemnon disappeared into what we call today the Greek Dark Age. For nearly 400 years, their written language, Linear B, ceased to exist. Greece had forgotten how to write. In the Levant, the prosperous cities of Canaan and Ugarit were turned to ash. The letters from Ugarit's king, still unfired on clay, tell us of enemies at the gates, but when help might have come, it was already too late. The city was obliterated, its harbors choked with broken ships and charred timber. And then came Egypt. Ramses III described them as a tide. The foreign lands made a conspiracy in their islands. They came with fire prepared before them, united together. No land could stand before them. Their hands were upon the land as far as the circle of the earth. They came not only as warriors, but with their families, their wagons, their herds, entire peoples moving together. They were not merely raiders, they were nations uprooted, hungry, and armed. The Pharaoh met them at the Nile Delta in one of history's first recorded naval battles. Egyptian reliefs show ships locked in combat, sea peoples with feathered headdresses and horned helmets clashing against Egyptian marines. Arrows darkened the skies. Ships splintered as Ramses' navy rammed their enemies head-on. On the riverbanks, Egyptian archers fired relentlessly, turning the waterways into graveyards of broken ships. Ramses claimed victory. He boasted that the invaders were crushed and scattered, but his own inscriptions betray the truth. The storm was not ended. Though Egypt survived, it emerged weakened, its resources drained. Egypt would never again be the empire it once was. Across the Mediterranean, trade collapsed. Tin, the lifeblood of bronze, no longer reached the foundries. Without it, weapons dulled, economies faltered, and armies weakened. Farmers fled their lands, cities shrank, writing systems disappeared. Within a century, the vibrant, interconnected world of the Bronze Age had become a wasteland of ruins. The Sea Peoples were not the only cause of this collapse. Famine, drought, earthquakes, all may have played their part. But they were the blade that struck hardest, the storm that swept away kingdoms. Wherever they landed, fire followed. And so, historians still ask, were the Sea Peoples destroyers or simply survivors of an already crumbling world, forced into conquest by desperation? One thing is certain, in their wake lay silence. An age had ended. The Sea Peoples are remembered not for what they built, but for what they destroyed. And yet, the greatest mystery of all is this. Where did they come from? The Egyptians named them, but their words raise more questions than answers. On the walls of Medinet Habu, Ramses III lists tribes with strange names: Shurdan, Shekelish, Peliset, Denyen, Jeker, Weshesh. Were these different nations united in common cause? Or fragments of a shattered world, thrown together by desperation? Archaeologists and historians have debated for centuries. Some see in the Shurdan the shadow of Sardinia warriors who may have set sail from the western Mediterranean. Others trace the Shekelish to Sicily, or the Denyen to the Aegean, perhaps even linked to the Danaans of Greek legend. The Peliset, many believe, became the Philistines settling in the coasts of Canaan and remembered in the Bible as bitter foes of Israel. But what drove them from their homelands? One theory points to climate. Around 1200 BC, the Mediterranean may have suffered years of drought and famine. Crops failed, harvests dwindled, and entire populations were forced to seek food and fertile land elsewhere. Another theory speaks of earthquake storms that shattered cities, collapsing walls and temples, leaving survivors adrift. Still others suggest the collapse of trade itself. When bronze could no longer be made, economies faltered, and once, proud nations turned to piracy, raiding neighbors to survive. And then, there is the possibility of war. The Bronze Age was an age of kings and empires, but also of unrest. Perhaps the Sea Peoples were rebels, mercenaries cast aside, outlaws exiled from fallen kingdoms, banding together in a confederation of desperation. Their weapons tell part of the story. Reliefs show warriors armed not with chariots, the pride of the Bronze Age elite, but with swords and long spears fighting on foot, in close quarters, like infantry. This was a new way of war, less dependent on wealth, more reliant on numbers and ferocity. Against cities weakened by famine and stretched by war, these tactics proved devastating. But perhaps the greatest clue lies not in their destruction, but in their survival. After the storms of invasion, some of these peoples seem to have settled permanently in the lands they once attacked. The Philistines of the Bible, the Peliset of Egyptian records, built cities in Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ashdod. Archaeologists digging in those sites have found pottery strikingly similar to that of the Aegean. It is as if a fragment of Greek culture had been transplanted into the heart of Canaan. So, were the Sea Peoples a single, mysterious nation? Or were they many? Were they invaders or refugees, conquerors or survivors? 3,000 years later, the debate still rages. And perhaps that is fitting for the Sea Peoples, who were less a nation than a storm. A storm made of many winds, many peoples, and many stories, converging in one cataclysm that ended the Bronze Age. The Sea Peoples should not have won. On paper, the Bronze Age kingdoms had every advantage. Egypt fielded vast armies, its pharaohs commanding wealth beyond measure. The Hittites controlled an empire that stretched across Anatolia. The Mycenaean kings ruled from fortified palaces built on stone hills, their walls so massive the Greeks themselves would later call them Cyclopean, as if only giants could have built them. And yet, one by one, these powers crumbled before a storm of wandering peoples. How? First, the weapon of timing. The Bronze Age was already fragile. Empires depended on long trade routes for copper and tin. When harvests failed, when trade faltered, famine spread quickly. Armies starved before they marched. Cities burned from within before enemies struck from without. The Sea Peoples arrived at exactly the moment when the great kingdoms were weakest, when the old order teetered on the edge. Second, the weapon of iron. Bronze had been the lifeblood of the age, but it was brittle and costly. By 1200 BC, iron was beginning to appear a metal harder, cheaper, and more abundant. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of the Sea Peoples carried iron blades and spears, giving them an edge over defenders who still clung to bronze. Against weary garrisons and faltering armies, even a small advantage in weapons could prove decisive. Third, the weapon of mobility. While the kings of the Bronze Age trusted their heavy chariots, symbols of wealth and power, the Sea Peoples fought differently. They fought on foot, in close combat, in flexible formations that could adapt to broken terrain and coastal raids. Their ships carried warriors swiftly from one city to the next, striking suddenly before defenders could gather. Reliefs in Egypt show their long ships with curved prows, capable of swift maneuvering, perfect for surprise assaults on coastal towns. Fourth, the weapon of desperation. The Sea Peoples were not raiding for plunder alone. They brought their families, their livestock, their entire way of life. They fought not just as warriors, but as migrants with nothing to lose. A kingdom can retreat behind its walls, but a people with no homeland cannot retreat at all. They pressed forward with a ferocity born of survival. And finally, the weapon of fear. The Bronze Age was an interconnected world. When one city fell, trade routes collapsed. When one kingdom burned, allies lost hope. The Sea Peoples thrived on this domino effect. The fall of Ugarit terrified its neighbors. The silence of the Hittites left their vassals adrift. Rumor itself became a weapon city, surrendered at the sight of sails on the horizon, convinced that resistance was futile. In the end, The Sea Peoples succeeded not because they were stronger, but because the world they entered was already breaking. They were the final push, the catalyst of collapse, the spark that set dry fields ablaze. The pharaohs recorded their victories against these invaders, chiseling triumph into stone. But behind those walls of hieroglyphs lies a deeper truth. Egypt survived, but only barely. The Hittites did not. The Mycenaeans did not. Ugarit did not. The Sea Peoples were a storm. And no matter how high the walls, no city could hold forever against the wind and the fire they carried. When the smoke cleared, the Bronze Age was gone. The palaces that had once ruled the seas lay in ruins. The trade networks that had tied Egypt to Anatolia, Crete to Canaan, were severed. Cities that had stood for centuries, Ugarit, Mycenae, Hattusa, were abandoned to silence and dust. The collapse was so vast, so complete, that historians call it the First Great Dark Age. For Greece, it meant centuries of silence. Writing disappeared. The linear B script vanished. For nearly 400 years, the ancestors of Homer's heroes lived without literacy. Their legends passed only in song and memory. This silence gave birth, centuries later, to the epics of the Iliad and the Odyssey tales, born from a world that no longer existed. In Anatolia, the proud Hittite Empire was erased, its lands fractured into small kingdoms, its legacy scattered. Only faint echoes survived in Assyrian records, in forgotten fortresses buried under earth. A superpower of the ancient world had been extinguished. Egypt alone remained, but it too was scarred. The Pharaoh Ramses III repelled the invaders, but at great cost. Grain stores were depleted, armies drained, and the Nile Kingdom, once the beating heart of the ancient world, entered a slow decline. Never again would Egypt reach the heights of its earlier glory. And yet, out of this chaos, new peoples emerged. The Peliset, likely the Philistines, settled along the coast of Canaan. They built cities like Gaza and Ashkelon, leaving behind pottery that fused Aegean styles with local traditions. Their arrival changed the balance of power in the Levant, shaping the stories of the Old Testament. To the north, Phoenicia rose from the ashes, its sailors reclaiming the sea and building the foundations of a maritime empire that would stretch to Carthage. Even the Greeks, plunged into darkness, carried forward fragments of memory. From the collapse of their palaces rose the seeds of a new civilization, one that, centuries later, would give us philosophy, democracy, and the legacy of the classical age. The Sea Peoples did not create monuments. They built no empire of their own. And yet, their legacy is written in absence, in the silence where cities once stood, in the ruins where empires once ruled. They were both destroyers and midwives, ending one age and forcing the birth of another. This is the paradox of history. Out of ruin comes renewal, but the renewal cannot erase the horror. For those who lived through it, the collapse was not destiny. It was fire. It was hunger. It was terror in the night when strange sails appeared on the horizon. To us, 3,000 years later, the Sea Peoples are shadows, fragments of names, echoes of battles, shards of pottery. To those who saw them, they were the storm that swallowed their world. And in that silence, the Bronze Age ended. 3,000 years ago, the world ended. Not with a single battle, not with one empire falling, but with many, all at once. Palaces burned, scripts forgotten, kings slain, and cities abandoned. And at the heart of this cataclysm, we see only a shadow, the Sea Peoples. They came from somewhere beyond the horizon. They brought war, fire, hunger, and change. And then, as suddenly as they appeared, they vanished back into the sea of history, leaving us with ruins and riddles. Who were they? Were they conquerors? Pirates? Desperate refugees? Were they the hand of fate, or simply the storm that struck a world already crumbling? We may never know. The Sea Peoples left no monuments, no chronicles, no certain homeland to trace. They live only in the words of their enemies, pharaohs who fought them, cities that feared them, survivors who cursed their names. And yet, their ghost lingers, Every time we look at the ruins of Hattusa, every time we imagine the last night of Ugarit, every time we recall that even mighty Egypt trembled, we are remembering the sea peoples. History often honors the builders, the kings, the architects, the empires, but sometimes it is the destroyers who leave the deepest mark. The sea peoples remind us that civilizations, no matter how strong, can be fragile, that prosperity can vanish in a generation, that even the mightiest walls cannot hold forever against the tides of change. Perhaps that is why their story still haunts us. Because the mystery of the sea peoples is not only a question about the past, it is a warning for the future. Civilizations rise, civilizations fall. And sometimes, all it takes is a storm from the sea. The sea peoples remain nameless shadows, yet their impact shaped the destiny of nations. In their silence, they whisper a truth, that history does not belong only to the builders, but also to those who bring the walls crashing down.